G'day Peter, how are you?
Morning, Andrew. I'm good, thank you.
It's Andrew Douglas again, and I'm here with Peter Jackson, one of our principals in Sydney, for episode 4 of The Plough, where we deal with the challenges of the farm on legal issues that arise. And Peter is our farm expert, one of our Sydney principals. So welcome, and thank you for coming along.
Great pleasure.
We're going to talk about challenges for farmers. Peter, when we look at what are the modern challenges for farmers, they're not like they were 40 or 50 years ago, are they?
It's exactly correct, Ben.
40 or 50 years ago, farmers held property almost on trust for families and assumed that that farm would always follow through, and usually with the eldest son or one of the sons would take on the farming property and they would inherit everything, including the debt that was incurred along the way. But I think the world's changed fairly dramatically, hasn't it? And we know now that the exposure of farms to overseas markets, we know that climate change and a whole lot of things have changed what you actually do farm. And so people who were single type farmers, I'm a sheep farmer from Colac, are suddenly faced with the process that maybe lamb prices dive very dramatically. Things can change quite dramatically. And so farming has become quite a complex business. And I think what's left farmers with is this very difficult problem where they're sitting there with a family. They're often 60 or 70 contemplating retirement. They've not taken any money out of the business really for a long period of time. And in fact, the business is so encumbered by debt because the lenders are very happy to lend because the asset value behind the business. They've got a son who's been working in the business for 20 years without taking anything out of the business. So they get food, they get cars, they get somewhere to live, but they don't actually draw any money out of it. And the other 2 or 3 brothers and sisters go, it's a $20 million property here, and you're going to leave it all to a son. And the conflict begins. So I thought setting the scene is sort of a fairly important issue to do, but what we might just do now is just talk about market challenges. The market challenges, I think, Peter, that are arising at the moment are, as I've said, the need to deal with a volatile market, the need to actually make money out of an asset. So most farmers farming in a traditional way will have a 2 to 3% return on capital, whereas a substantial business should be returning upwards of 8 to 9% at least. And the more successful corporate farmers are actually achieving that. On top of that, debt has cost more money. Debt is growing on farms throughout Australia, and smaller farms are no longer viable. So we're seeing this market push towards larger farming with multi different things that are being done on that farm in a more corporatized event. Peter, what are you seeing with your clients?
Largely seeing a need to diversify. Farmers that I act for and know, they're looking to find ways to make an income out of this asset and leave that asset and that income to the whole of the family in a fair way, and that is a considerable struggle.
Yeah, it's hard, isn't it? Because the dynamics of being a farmer, particularly if you've come from a traditional method of farming, is that you don't make a lot of money. You don't make a lot of cash money. You have a lot of asset, which sort of impacts pensions and impacts everything. And commonly, the other market force, which is really alive at the moment, that entitles or enlivens this capacity to generate more income, is the Asian market, which is buying from provenance. It's actually saying, Peter, you have a farm and you sell cheese, you sell milk from your farm, which we're going to use in cheese, but we want to celebrate your green cheese, not green cheese, but the fact of your green credentials, and therefore we're going to buy at a premium from you. The processor will just clip the ticket on the way through, but we want to say it's Peter's Farm's cheese. And through all industries, whether it's fruit, whether it's cattle, whether it's lamb, no matter what it is, there is this from sort of farm to restaurant door, there is this branding of farming that is arising, particularly for the Asian market. And that is generating a lot more money for farmers, but they have to run a much smarter business to be able to do it. So they're all the challenges that are coming at farmers who've been brought up as traditional farmers. I think the other thing, which isn't so much a market force, but is a real difficult issue, is that farmers are not inclined to speak openly about their emotions and about their hopes and futures. They're inclined to have their head down and just be working.
Yes.
So what I thought we might talk about is about making promises. Farms struggling a little bit, they bring in their accountant and they go, we haven't made a lot of money, have we, over the last 6 months? The son's there with his wife, none of the other children are there. It's a $20 million asset. Their favourite accountant is sitting in the room. He's been meticulously keeping proper accounting records on the basis that both the property and the business are the one asset. The farmer and his wife are there going, well, no, the property is mine. The business is something that I'm in partnership with my son. Not true, but thinking that, and they start having a conversation. And the accountant starts making a few notes as to what that is, not very detailed notes. At that stage, is that something that the law would recognise?
Well, the law has to take regard to it because it's part of the factual matrix of what went on with this family. So when a court finally has to determine what the parties intended, they have to look, the judge will look at all of those things.
Including the tax records, won't they?
Indeed, and the tax records and how assets were treated, and irrespective of what the elderly parents consider, that is, that the farm land is our property, not part of the partnership. If over many years the accountants have put that in as an asset of the partnership, the judge will say, well, clearly it is, and everybody treated it as it is.
And they'll go to the bank borrowing documents, which will say exactly the same thing.
Borrowed money on that basis.
Yeah.
So the key to that, and what that leads to, is the kind of need for careful consideration of what the actual position is, and when the kinds of conversations that occur take place as you described, there is not that clarity. It is really aspirational, or there's a wish list.
And maybe just there's a short time of cash shortage where you have a discussion, and yes, you do think it'll proceed and you're going to do this deal now and it's for the future, but 3 years later there's a really couple of very good seasons and everyone reverts back to thinking what it was, but the son may not.
And the son may not. But the other side of that, and the other aspect of that, which is important, which impacts on all of this, is what has been said to the other children. Very often, the other children will say that, well, Dad told us to go off and get a university education, but the farm will always be here for you. And you don't have to worry, you will be looked after, but I want you to go off to university, get an education, be a lawyer, be a doctor. And that's what they do. And they work hard and they study hard and they become lawyers and doctors and bankers and all sorts of things and earn a reasonable living. But nonetheless, when the parents die, they see this $20 million asset being passed to their brother. And they say, well, is this quite fair? And
the brother says, but I've never had a wage.
And the brother says, I've never had a wage. I was the one who stayed back here and did all the work and made this a $20 million asset. So that's the dispute, which is very, very unfortunate.
And the problem with modern litigation compared to litigation of 30 years ago, when I used to do what was called testator's family maintenance action arguments about whose entitlement there was under a will, is there was almost no documents recording what happened.
Indeed.
But now, accountants putting stuff in his laptop, they're sending emails to each other, they're using text messages.
Lodging tax returns.
They're lodging tax returns, they're doing all these things. And that all becomes part of the bounty of what sits on the table when we decide who owns what. So can I just say at this stage, Peter, there is a time, and it should be sooner rather than later, but certainly before kids finish their university educations, where people sit down as a family and go, we're going to get some advice. We're going to determine what is the right structure for this farm, whether the farm is part of that business asset. We're going to do all that, and we're going to start talking to you about what we have, what expectations there are, so nobody is disappointed.
Yeah.
But the most important thing at that stage is to get clarity and to make sure that all subsequent documents align with what that understanding is. And that includes the will. But the will, I just want you to understand, the will is not final. The will is a
living document.
Is a living document, but it's not final. And even if it is the will that goes at the time of the death, what's happened beforehand will have an impact on overturning that. And I think probably at that stage, it wouldn't be such a bad idea to just have a look at the case law. What do you think, Peter? Okay, we're going to go to case law, and Peter's going to talk about Fragger's case, because I think it's a New South Wales Supreme Court case.
Yeah.
Fascinating case. What's the facts behind Fragger?
Well, in 2014, the family sat down with their accountant, their business advisor, and they discussed this very issue of the parents, the elderly parents, wanting to retire, but they couldn't retire at that stage because they had too much income, and so they had to defer retirement. The daughter-in-law said, look, but the business, the farm, was under some financial stress. The daughter-in-law said, well, I'm to receive an inheritance of $300,000 within a few months. I'm happy to put that into the farm. And for that, I would like to be given a share of the partnership. And that happened. She put the money in. That went to the elderly parents. That was enough for them to buy a house in town and some other personal things like a car and so on. So at that moment, everyone was happy, but there wasn't enough clarity about what would happen when they eventually retired, when the parents eventually retired from the farm, and the basis on which they would retire. And there wasn't also clarity as to what the assets of the partnership were. And then and then things moved along, and a year later, the parents finally retired. They applied for a pension, and the pension was granted, but after a short time, the department wrote to them and asked for the money back because they owned land, and the land was, on paper, they still owned the land, and the land was worth a great deal of money, so they weren't entitled to a pension, and they had to pay that money back. And unfortunately for them and for everyone involved, they in fact only held that land on trust for the partnership, so that they could have held on to the pension had they made the case to the department.
And it's worth just stopping there, isn't it, Peter? So you've got your first bit of advice that crystallises ownership. There's a change in your life, and one of the first things when someone retires is to look at pension planning.
Yeah.
But to not look at pension planning and to not understand the legal effect of ownership at that stage is fatal.
Absolutely fatal, and not have clarity as to what the assets, because the parents believed that the property, the land, was theirs.
Yes.
And in truth, it wasn't. It was an asset of the partnership.
And that was found out later after the husband died, and the wife sought to appoint a trustee to sell the land.
Indeed.
And was eventually told, after what appears to be quite an expensive court case, no, you don't actually have an asset in the land, you're just holding it on trust for your son.
For the partnership, for the farming partnership. And that went on for 10 years. It was only earlier this year that the court made a final decision, which is extraordinarily sad for that family.
I think it's terrible, but it raises the issues that we repeatedly see with farming families. We commonly see mum and dad really unable to properly retire. They forego ownership and management of a property, but they end up with less than what they ever had. And then they're really living in a very frugal, difficult way after spending their life running this very significant asset and living quite well.
Yeah.
And the son is off executing what he needs to do on the farm. Now, that comes back to another issue, which is in modern farming, it's not always the son who is the best farmer. So there is this real issue about succession, about running a business. When I run a business, I have a CEO and a CFO and a COO. I don't pretend for a second I can run a business. I can't. For anyone who wants to know about it, I'm hopeless at it. Look, I'm a good lawyer. That's me blowing my own trumpet, but I'm not the greatest business leader. Now I know that, so I don't pretend to do it. And yet the legacy of this business, which is about the same size as those farms, we'd never contemplate me running that business. So part of getting your act together as a farmer is saying, look, what do I know about markets overseas? What are my relationships with that market? What am I good at running a business? Do I know how to get return out of business? Do I know how to make sure that I make money out of irrigation rather than losing money on irrigation? All those sort of questions. They're just got to be asked about, because if you don't ask those questions, then what you're basically doing is you're putting a corporal in charge of an armory.
One of the issues that I've seen arise is that traditionally the father has looked after the books and looked after, talking to the accountant and talking to the lawyer, talking to me. I'm thinking of one family, it's always the father who rings me, and there are 5 children. They all know me, but he is the one who talks to me, and he is the one who does all of the books on the farm, but it is one of the sons who does the farming.
Yep.
So that on his death, there is a lingering concern about who will attend to the books, because he has never done that. He is a very good, very competent farmer, and that's part of this lack of clarity, lack of discussion. There needs to be discussion about all of these issues, and probably regularly. I think we've spoken before about probably there should be this sort of meeting, perhaps once a year.
Yeah.
And where are we this year?
I think that's good. Why don't we go on to talking about what is the good practice? You and I both sit around farming families. We both do work with farming families. Some of my work is much more painful work. In fact, I'm dealing with safety and the death of people on farms. But when we look at what does good practice look like, it's not that different to what practice looks like in any succession management in any business. The difference in farms is they don't see themselves as a business, they see themselves as a family. And for that reason, the head of a family makes a decision and everyone says that's good up until the head of the family dies. And then everyone says that's bad because they never articulated what that decision was. So the practice that you and I do is normally to have a family meeting with everyone to start with and say, we're going to do this from tin tacks. We're going to talk about the farm. We're going to talk about houses. We're going to talk about paintings. We'll actually put names on the back of things. We just want to go through this and say who will have what upon death and what will be the path of transition to allow your parents to retire comfortably and safely. What is going to be the path for each other person. And we're going to document that very accurately. And we're going to provide that as a document, which will be revised yearly as we come back. And there will be times when we alter legal documents like titles and things like that as we go through to reflect candidly exactly where we are. Now, that's sort of the discussion. You're better at the detail, Peter. What do you do?
Well, exactly that. I think that those sorts of discussions need to be in the form of acknowledgements. It may be that we can't, the parents, we can't buy a unit in the city for the parents for the moment because there isn't enough cash. But there should be an acknowledgement that that's where we're heading, and then that's an immediate term, and then there should be the longer term acknowledgements about who is running the farm and what the other family members are getting out of that enterprise. Again, in the immediate medium term and in the long run on death of the parents.
I want to raise an issue here, which a number of farmers are going to turn off as I raise this, but that's the use of debt. You use debt for liquidity. You don't use debt because you're in trouble. So you use debt to finance operations, to create wealth. And in any business that you're in, all of us know that your debt ratio is critical, but the debt must be used to create wealth. It can't be used just to fill in holes. It's not like sand that you just shovel about. That's not what happens in farms. Because of the cycle, the seasonality of farming, and particularly traditional farming, debt is used to cover bad seasons. And it just keeps accruing because cash is thin in traditional farming. So one of the issues that must be dealt with up front is, what is the debt we have? How are we going to amortize that debt? And in the succession discussion, what will be the debt that is inherited along the path, and why are we inheriting debt? Because what does happen is that year on year, farms get further and further into debt simply because bad things happen, not to actually make profit, just to make stability. If you don't have that discussion about debt, there is real problems, because people suddenly turn up and they've got a $20 million property, and we keep using that. It could be a 10 million, 5 million, whatever. But there is a 1-to-3 debt ratio, which makes the farm unviable, because you can't make that much cash on a farm. So for me, one of the very first discussions I do is, I normally say, well, let's have the accountant in the room, but let's talk about the affordability of the debt we have, and let's talk about amortization.
And how it can be managed.
Yeah.
How the debt can be managed.
Yeah, I mean, are we using debt to improve our capital? And coming back to another issue, remember, you've got all this acreage. There's not a steel fence around it that stops you doing something. So dad and mum want to go out to sell off a portion of the less profitable land to help them do that. Actually, it's not such a bad idea. Like, it's not to say, oh no, you've got to wait, but they've been waiting. They've been working that farm for 50 years, and to say, look, we don't have a lot of cash, mum. And you look, mum looks and goes, no, but I've paid all your children's education. I've paid all your education. I've forgone everything. All I want now is, like in the case we were talking about, is a little unit in Dubbo. Just sell a bit of land.
Yes.
This is not a trust that you can never sell. You can't.
And there are other ways of achieving that. I mean, for example, I have farming families that lock up part of the land in the forest part of the land, and they earn carbon credits, and they earn significant money every quarter by selling the carbon credits. And there are now firms that manage that for you completely. They'll do the base calculation, and they'll do the quarterly calculation, collect the money from the government and so on. And and perhaps an imaginative way of dealing with mum and dad and their desire to have this unit in town is to say, well, that money is allocated for that purpose. And they can be significant monies, and that kind of arrangement doesn't interfere with the farming, because you're only locking up the trees, so that the farming continues as normal. It's just that you have this arrangement earning money for you.
Well, let's talk now a little bit about debt. We've already earmarked the risks around debt, but Peter, let's talk about farm mediations and what's that about. Can you explain that further?
Yeah, in both Victoria, New South Wales, and indeed other states, there is legislation titled the Farm Debt Mediation Act, and before a creditor can take an enforcement action, they are required to invite the farmer to participate in a mediation, and that is a good thing. But that is at the end of the debt problem, if you like, and by that stage, often the farmer is in terrible trouble, and being invited to a mediation, while it is a good thing and while it prevents enforcement action in the medium term, doesn't solve the problem. Both pieces of legislation in New South Wales and Victoria have provision that allow the farmer to approach the creditor if they believe they are heading for difficulty. And it always seemed to me that that is the better time to use the energy of that legislation, because if the creditor refuses to participate in the mediation, there are sanctions that the legislation applies against the creditor, so that it is of value, but it requires from the farmer and the accountant advisors a real assessment that we're heading towards a difficulty and we should do something now, not wait until we get a demand from the bank, but do it earlier.
And look, part of these issues are commonly there's several different parts of debt treated differently, which can be rolled up. There is a whole number of ways to go through it. But I think what Peter's saying is so true. And we see it in their clients in our insolvency practice, where we have a quite substantial insolvency practice where people bury their head in the sand. There will be times in farming, just simply because the way the climate is chaotic now, where you'll have 3 or 4 bad seasons, whereas once you'd have 1 in 4 years, you might have 3 or 4, and suddenly the debt is biting you, and it's biting you hard. At that stage, don't put your head down. You have this piece of legislation. Come and chat to Peter. What can I do? What can I do to get through this process? And usually there are good ways of getting through by changing the nature of the way the debt is held or paid for a period of time, which allows you that breathing space.
And generally, and I think this is almost universal, the banks and the creditor organisations respond to that kind of approach. They don't want difficult debt issues. So they respond to an early approach, particularly if that early approach is rational and sensible and promotes a plan that will see this business prosper. That is in the interest of the creditor.
Yeah. All right. Well, look, I think we just touched on that briefly, but I do want to go now to talking about, well, what happens when you get all this wrong and your children are unhappy. So let's talk about angry children and their access to courts. All right, Peter, this is unfortunately part of the litigation that Costine in Sydney does for you, and we do some down here too. What are children's rights when they're not happy with a will or arrangement that's occurred?
Well, they have the right to approach the court and ask the court to effectively rewrite the will, to impose on the will maker and the will some moral rightness as to how the property should have been divided and the assets in the estate, and that and that is most often bitter litigation.
It is awful, isn't it? It does. It tears them apart, because part of the assessment is what is the contributions that have been made.
What are the contributions? What are the contributions that have been made? What are the circumstances of each of the applicants, of each of the children?
Yeah.
And there's often a mix, of course. There's often a mix between trying to an effort to adjust the will as against the promises that have been made by the father or the mother. Promises have been made, that I would always be looked after.
Yeah.
And that impacts on the will.
And they're often as diffuse as that, aren't they? So it's the promise, look, don't worry about anything, Peter, you'll be okay.
Indeed.
And when it comes to the bounty of the state, and it is going to be sold up because it's the subject of litigation, and the monies that everyone litigates are being drawn from the estate as well. So it becomes a diminishing estate quite rapidly. You have this situation where there'll be one wealthy person, there'll be one poorer person, there'll be somebody who's never drawn a wage and wants to stay on the farm, who's made an enormous contribution to it. But there'll be these diffuse promises, and they're documented. There'll be a letter that Jenny comes and said, look, I'm so glad you're off doing your pharmacy degree. I hope you have a great life, but never forget we'll look after you in the end.
The farm is here for you.
Yeah, and the son will be saying, but you then went and married a wealthy person.
Indeed.
And that's the fight. It is all the personal circumstances that happen in court. And the only thing that I'm really clear on after running half a dozen of those cases when I was a young man is nobody likes each other at the end.
It's very sad, very sad.
So which it comes back to our early part about planning, doesn't it? That this real need for planning.
And you get into the generational aspect of that as well, because you have the son who has worked the farm for 40 years, and sometimes 40 years. He himself has a son coming on, and he says, well, it's not only me, I'm the one who stayed here, I'm the one who did all this work, but I have my own son who is now in his mid-20s, and he wants to come onto the farm, and it really is for him. So that you have this sort of terrible, generational complexity, which is very, very sad.
So coming back, Peter, and I guess just to wrap up in some ways, how do we get farming family harmony?
Clarity. I mean,
just clarity. That's the answer, isn't it?
Clarity. Yeah.
We're not going to talk about safety and environment and other issues today, but I think for Peter and I, and neither of us are young, if you didn't notice that, we've seen things fall apart by the most crazy things. So when I was a young man working in Tasmania, we used to have a Scottsdale office, and I used to go out there as a litigator, and I'd sit there with families who decided to have their first conversation. And I'd say to them, okay, have you made any promises yet? Well, we promised Jenny she's going to go to school. Okay, that's a private school. Okay, good. Okay, well, there's a lump of cash you're going to have. And I'd go through and I'd do this broadsheet of all the money they've promised to spend. And then I'd say, how much are you making a year off the farm? And they'd go, I said, oh, well, that just means you're going to go broke, doesn't it, really? Have you promised anything about assets, about the old ute? Who gets the... And then we'd list all the assets. And I'd say, okay, well, let's stick something on them that says whose it is. Let's write down... Because one of the terrible things after someone dies is angry people go and loot the house. That's the truth. They steal stuff. So I would list the things, and then we'd go and I'd give them stickers, and they'd go and stick on the back of photographs and all. The reason I did it was my first 4 years of a lawyer, I sat through the most tempestuous and awful disputes where I saw families torn about over something like one painting. I saw a fight that went over a kitchen stove. Grandma had this beautiful old wood kitchen stove. And there was an argument that was agitated around who owned the stove. And I was looking at them, I said, it's worth $100. I'll buy one. Don't worry, I'll take it out of my own pocket. I'll buy it. No, it was Grandma. Be aware that sentimentality and a whole lot of things come into this. So clarity about absolutely everything, right down to the painting on the wall, whatever it is. Don't be embarrassed to have that discussion, because your kids will thank you for it. They'll be able to go, I don't have to worry about this anymore. I know what I'm getting. I don't want to be greedy. They'll have all the right intentions way out from the period of death. But by the time death comes, lives have often changed. People have failed in business. People have married people who don't like the family. There's all sorts of other dynamics that fall into place.
Have their own children.
Yeah, so please, clarity in every step, yearly renewed, anniversary renewed, like a board meeting where people sit down and discuss things. But most of all, can you please look after the mother and father, who are the family owners, because sadly they are the ones who wear it all. And when somebody dies, often the father, the dispute is enlivened and the mother is left literally holding the baby that's being dissected in front of her. It is just awful. Peter, lovely to have you down. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you really enjoyed it today. I know this has been a legal discussion, and the plough will more often be around the commerciality of farms, but it's something that a number of our solicitors are involved in every day, is managing farming succession and farming dispute. And we do know that there is an easy pathway through this. What we know better, though, is there's a shocking pathway if you don't. Thank you again.